Good evening, everyone. My name is Sylvia Kim, and I am a committee member with the Asia Society Southern California Asian Women Empowered Initiative. In celebration of Women's History Month, we are extremely honored to have a series of conversations recognizing innovators, innovative women in finance and investments. Tonight, we're delighted to be joined by Kathy Matsui, who is one of the top financial executives in Asia, and as I told her myself, a total legend in the women in VC community. I know we'll be hearing more from her in just a few moments, but she is also the general partner of Japan's first ESG-focused global venture fund, MPower Partners, the one who coined the term womenomics, used to influence economic policies by Shinzo Abe in Japan, and the first female partner at Goldman Sachs in Japan, among many of her long list of accolades. So welcome, Kathy. As we get started, Kathy, you have spent your entire career empowering fellow women in the workplace. Can you tell us a little bit about your career and personal journey and why you are such a lifelong advocate of womenomics and what the term womenomics even means?
Sure, and thank you to the Asia Society of Southern California for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be with this community. So, Sylvia, to answer your question, my former career was as a Japanese equity market strategist. Longest duration was with Goldman Sachs, where I retired at the end of 2020 after a 26-year career there. And the genesis of womenomics was very simple. I began my career at perhaps the worst time one can possibly begin their career as a Japanese equity strategist, which is right after the Japanese asset bubble and the asset market peaked, which was 1989, 1990. And so it was sort of downhill from there. The economy was crumbling, the stock markets were crashing, property prices were collapsing, deflation was setting in. And of course, there are lots of questions about where's the growth going to come from? And so my job as a strategist was to try to give, crystal ball predictions about where Japan was headed, but I was confronted with many challenging questions, particularly from overseas investors along the lines of, so Kathy, tell me one good reason I should invest in Japan. Very, very hard, tough questions to answer at that time. Meanwhile, in my personal life, I had given birth to my son in 1996. I took 4 months, the standard for Goldman, maternity leave, returned to work full-time in the same job. But I noticed that around me, other Japanese, I call them mommy friends. Of course, some of them opted to become full-time moms, which I totally respect. But I had many other friends who wanted to return to their careers as well, but for a whole host of reasons, were unable to do so and were frustrated. So I had these two juxtaposed situations in my work and in my personal life. And all I could think of was this Japanese word that everybody I think knows, which is mottainai. What a waste that there's this incredible talent, half the population of this nation, that was being underutilized. And as an analyst, I have the luxury of playing with numbers. So I did an assessment. If you could, narrow that gender employment gap, Japan had very low female labor participation rate when I started working on womenomics. What if you could, narrow that gap? What could that do to GDP? And of course, the upside was enormous. At least 10% lift to GDP was my conclusion back then. So I frankly didn't intend for this one report, to become any kind of key, catalyst for Japan's government policy agenda. It was merely, as an analyst, trying to come up with some kind of scenario that would be that would create a more positive outlook for Japan's future. And I was also, in my entire career, believe it or not, the only female equity strategist in Japan's market. So I figured my male competitors would never write about this topic. So That was another reason, but it wasn't really until 2013, like you said, when the Abe government really latched on to this concept of diversity as a driver of economic growth that it really started to gain traction. So it wasn't instantaneous. It was quite. It took a long time for the nation, for society to start to understand and comprehend that diversity is really an imperative for growth.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That's a fascinating kind of backstory. And you're right, change definitely takes time. And we know that a lot of the work you've done has been in the specific context of Japan, and that each country, each market has its own kind of unique characteristics. We would be curious to kind of know, do you feel that since they did take this into kind of his policy work, has there been progress specifically in Japan? And what challenges remain, especially for women in Japan, and maybe speaking broadly beyond Japan as well?
Absolutely. And I think, yes, because this is not a challenge unique to Japan. We all know it may be challenges in varying degrees, but I think this is a pretty universal problem. But I think that how I explained our approach, which was to try to use empirical and objective data to show or demonstrate that greater diversity, say in leadership, can translate into higher growth, say for companies, right? Higher ROE or higher stock price performance, was really crucial to get the skeptics, because there are a lot of them, to believe, right? And so whilst of course diversity, and it's not just gender, of course, but diversity tends to, at least in Japan's context, has long been kind of discussed in the context of human rights and equality, which of course are super important. But if you don't care about those issues, it's hard for you to be convinced that this is an imperative that you need to worry about when you come into work every day. So I think that was probably the biggest shift, the positive shift that occurred. Secondly, until COVID, I mentioned earlier that Japan had a very low female participation rate for a very long time, in the mid 50% or so. But then it shot up from 2013 to 2019 up to 71%, which in fact surpassed the rates both in the United States as well as Europe, which shocks everybody. So record numbers of Japanese women were working outside the home, largely because of a combination of an expanding economy as well as an uber-tight job market, right? And the unemployment rate has been sitting at just around 2%. 85-9% of high school graduates can get a job here. That illustrates how tight the job market is. The other, I think, very important progress or area of progress is transparency. And for me as an analyst of companies, it was very hard to even figure out, we're not talking about moving the needle. We don't even know where that needle lies. So the government passed legislation, very important legislation in 2015, that requires companies and public sector organizations to disclose their gender statistics, and highly encouraged to issue targets of some sort. Now, it's not standardized, so companies can kind of issue whatever they want, but it was a huge step forward. And as I often say in Japan, shame and embarrassment are very powerful motivators for behavioral change. And if one company or sector has a 20%, or 30% female manager target, and the other one has 10, well, you can guess who's going to have an easier time recruiting, women for their organization. So I think those are the areas of progress. However, where there's still a lot of room for improvement is at the decision-making level. There's still a dearth of women in those key leadership positions, not just private sector, but public sector as well. But to me, Rome wasn't built in a day. You need to start with encouraging women to work outside the home. One of the issues is many of those women are working part-time roles, not full-time ones. So how do we encourage them to take on full-time roles, which of course is a conversation for all of society. But we are beginning to see more and more women, gradually rise up the ranks. And so I published a book 2 years ago, just before I left Goldman, about how to nurture female employees. And I found that speaking with a lot of CEOs here, now people get the why of diversity. They know why it's important. The challenge is how to implement, right? You've got high potential talent in your organization. That's great. But how do you promote? How do you nurture? How do you, motivate them to strive for leadership positions? So that's really a work in progress.
Thank you, Kathy. And I think that has a lot of implication outside of Japan as well. So it's really in the how. So just kind of shifting roles, because I know we have a limited amount of time and we could probably talk about just, your work in private equity and analysis for the full 30 minutes. But we did want to shift a little bit now to your current role. We know that you have now launched Japan's first ESG venture fund, led by an impressive all-women partnership. So tell us a little bit about MPower Partners and the significance of focusing exclusively on ESG.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So my two partners, Yumiko Murakami and Miwa Seki, we've actually been girlfriends for 25 plus years. And we have all extensive careers in finance, although more in the public equity space as opposed to private equity or venture. But we actually share the same birth month and birth year. So we've been celebrating our birthdays jointly for many years. And time again, we kind of always thought about what can we do to exert more impact directly onto Japanese society. It's a country, as many of you know, with very high quality talent, with frankly, plenty of capital, excluding the government, with some very cutting edge technologies. So why aren't there more, say, unicorns? Why isn't there more innovation overall? And we thought about, we have all experience in the ESG domains. It wasn't called ESG when I started, talking about diversity, or I wrote a lot also about Japanese corporate governance practices during my prior life. So we have expertise in these arenas. And if we targeted middle to later stage startups who are looking for, let's say, going public in a few years down the road or being acquired at some point, are they fully prepared for what's to come? And I don't mean that in a compliance context, like, oh, you got to tick off these boxes on ESG, which of course is part of it, but that's not the core. The core is it instilled in the DNA and culture of your company? And having worked with publicly traded companies, trying to convince them on why, governance best practices are important or why diversity will help their growth, and frankly, banging my head against the wall for many years because they're just established and fixed in their ways. It's harder to change companies when they're established, fully formed adults, versus working with companies when they're younger, say in their teenage years. Isn't it easier because they're more nimble, they're smaller, faster decision-making? And frankly, because they're younger, they actually get it. We don't have to do a lot of explaining as to the why ESG matters. They get it. But again, they have challenges with the how. And so that's where we come in. We come in to support. We don't dictate what's important for them in an ESG framework. They need to decide what their most material ESG factors are. And then based on those materialities, they determine what their KPIs will be X years down the road. But we're willing to support them hand in hand, partner with them to figure out, how to measure, say, carbon emissions, or if they don't have a very diverse board, we can help recruit, find those people. So things like that is what we plan to help with, and we think that what is the missing ingredient in the kitchen? We do think is ESG in terms of how to drive more scalable, sustainable, and global growth, particularly for Japanese ventures. By the way, we're roughly 2/3 It's a $150 million fund, and 2/3 Japan, but the rest is global. So we have made investments, for example, in the US as well. We can look anywhere, Asia included.
That's really good to know, Kathy. And, there's been this trend, being in impact investing myself, of, greenwashing, a lot of challenges around creating the right impact framework to actually measure impact. So curious, of course, in addition to the incredible expertise of yourself and your partners, of how MPower Partners plans to address that and kind of differentiate in terms of how impact will be measured.
That's a terrific question. And one of the additional reasons, frankly, why we believe ESG integration at the earlier stage of a company's development is so crucial, because it's not about, like I said, a box ticking exercise. It's about, first of all, taking a very deep look internally about what is your purpose as a company. What are you here on earth to do? And what do your employees think they're here to do? And aligning, that mission and that purpose. It really starts kind of at that core. And then from there, so to achieve that purpose, what kind of organization do you want to be? And like I said earlier, the war for talent here is super challenging. So you can imagine, it's one thing for Toyota, Sony to try to recruit quality talent. It's very, very, it's 1,000 times more challenging for a startup, right, with no name. But if they have a core purpose and it's clear and they articulate it, and let's say they are very emphasizing or prioritizing, they want a diverse and inclusive work environment, they want a very high employee engagement, they care about their customers, they care about the supply chain, these sorts of things, that to me helps avoid that risk of greenwash, right? Because it starts from within. And we also encourage a constant feedback loop between the management or the decision makers in the company and their internal and external stakeholders on this whole ESG kind of thinking, and we call it a roadmap. And so it's a constantly evolving process. But I think by doing so, you can really mitigate that risk of, they're just doing it for show, as opposed to genuinely meaning it. But it's absolutely a huge risk. And I think because ESG investing is booming everywhere so rapidly, you just put an ESG label on it and boom, you get a premium or money comes your way. It's particularly now under the scrutiny of regulators. It's under the scrutiny of asset owners and asset managers everywhere. So I think the bar to truly prove that you're ESG minded or integrated is only going to go higher.
I absolutely agree, and look forward to kind of your findings as MPower Partners continues on its journey. I'm sure there'll be a lot of trailblazing there as well. And so kind of shifting gears again, just because, you've been kind of this incredible expert and trailblazer in very male-dominated industries. Like you said, you're still kind of the only private equity or growth equity strategist in Japan. Curious of what advice you have for other women that are in finance and investment, especially Asian women. I know that you were kind of born and raised in California and then went to Japan. So I feel like you also have a very global international perspective about the kind of bicultural nature of a lot of the women who are in these industries. So would love to hear your advice, and then we'll start there.
Well, all I would say is that, finance was not, frankly, at the top of my list when I was looking for a job out of graduate school. I also was a humanities major in college. I majored in social studies. And so I often get the questions, especially from young students, as to, how should I prepare myself? What should I study? What should I major in to work in finance? And of course, I know you're going to get feedback from recruiters that it's easier if you have, your comp sci major, mathematics, or, data, whatever. Those are absolutely necessary, and that is absolutely true. Having said that, the careers in finance, as we all know, are so varied, right? There's such a huge range of opportunities that I think you should really think with an open mind about what is it that, what are your strengths? In my case, I was not a math major. And if you looked at my resume before I joined the industry, you'd have had a lot of question marks, frankly. But I kind of knew that I loved to write. I loved kind of macro, big picture issues. I actually wanted to join the Foreign Service in college. So that was kind of the direction my studies were headed. So I sort of thought, well, where's a job I could use what I like to do? And I love the client work. That to me, if it was just a think tank, I think I'd be bored out of my mind. But because I get that engagement with clients who, frankly, challenged me for 30 years, right? They're saying, no, Kathy, I totally disagree. And then we'd have these really, great debates and conversations that allowed me to grow as a person. So, so my advice would be, if this is something, that you're thinking about, just talk to people. To me, information is free. And I believe in not 6 degrees or whatever separation. I believe in max 2. You probably know somebody who knows somebody who you want to speak with, who's somebody you respect, who is doing something that you think, hey, that looks interesting. Go and meet them, have a Zoom with them. It's easy now with Zoom, with virtual, right? So just explore, and I think you'll come to understand that there's a lot of opportunities out there. And I love being in Asia. Sure, I'm from California, and right now doing VC. Why don't you do VC in America? I don't do VC in America because it's ultra competitive in America, right? What's my comparative advantage? I don't have much, but sitting here in Japan, we're an all-female. We'd actually push the gender aspect of our fund. They just know when we show up on a Zoom screen, they know we're different. But there's not a lot of people investing in VC that look at Japan. They look at China, right? Or they look at Israel, or they look at, of course, America. So the valuations here tend to be lower. There's not much information, frankly, in English still in private equity. So we've got that language, advantage. Japanese companies desperately need to go global, so we can help with that. So just trying to figure out, areas where we can exercise or leverage our comparative advantages. But to me, Asia is the place. It's obvious to say it's a place to be. It's so dynamic. There's so much variation. There's so many opportunities. There's emerging economies. There's developed economies. There's so many exciting and innovative companies cropping up here that sure you could do it from anywhere, but I think it really helps to be quote on the ground or close to the source of these ideas and building one's network.
That's amazing to hear, especially since Asian Women Empowered, we are trying to empower women everywhere, not just in United States, Asian women globally. And we're really about kind of giving to that next generation and empowering and uplifting this next generation of women. So kind of the last piece of advice I'll ask, because I actually have 2 kids myself. I know that you've been a working mom, and I love what you said about how this juxtaposition of being a mom and having your mom friends, and then seeing kind of a contrast with the statistics that you were looking at work, kind of led to the womenomics kind of revelation. Would be curious if you have also specific advice for working moms or any aspirations as we kind of raise daughters ourselves.
Yes, so I cannot claim to be any kind of model mother. I will say that up front.
I don't think any of us can.
I always get asked this question in Japan about how you manage work-life balance. And my immediate response to that question is, I try as much as possible never to use that term, because that term to me implies, 1/3 perfect wife, 1/3 perfect mother, 1/3 perfect career woman. And I don't know about all of you, but I don't know anybody who's successful who has any kind of perfect balance, like I've just described. And I love Sheryl Sandberg's line in her book, done is better than perfect. And I substitute now that term work-life balance with work-life equilibrium. So some days I could be 70% work and 30%, home. Some days other days it's completely flipped. I think in the beginning, I tried really hard to serve my kids like really healthy home cooked meals, and then I just, I don't know, just exhausted or jet lagged from a trip. And okay, they love the Happy Meal at McDonald's. I'll admit, I fed them McDonald's, okay, but were they happy? Yes. Are they alive? Yes. So hey, so I think particularly for women, and I'm going to say this, I know it's biased, but Asian women, super total perfectionist type A's, this is a challenge, right? To say, oh, I'm going to give in on this or give up on that. It's fine. Done is better than perfect. So and I think perfect is frankly, overrated anyway. So just do what you think feels right that day, that given day. And don't be so hard on yourself. I also have a lot of guilt about, should I have done this with my children? Oh, they didn't do so well in that. If you just dwell on that stuff, you're never going to move forward. They are their own human beings and they will make their own decisions. I think one important, I guess, lesson my husband and I learned is you have to let the kids own their decisions about everything. And if you continually intervene and say, no, I think this is good and you should do that, or XYZ, if it goes wrong, then it's our fault, not theirs, right? So that's kind of a bit of a philosophy path that I've tried to follow. It's not easy though, particularly for the moms. It's very, very difficult, but trying to let them make those decisions, fall on their feet, get back up on their own. That to me is how people grow.
Thank you so much for that, Kathy, and so much for your time today. I want to thank Asia Society Southern California once again, and just incredible to have you speak to this new initiative, Asian Women Empowered. I think there were a lot of incredible nuggets. We got it all in, and haven't heard of the equilibrium, definitely not balanced. So really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.